Clearly normal.
He's bright. I mean,
Just with this shade tree,
he's not in trouble.
they got the best brightest.
Yeah. Well, that's not always happens. They get the best and the brightest.
All right, good evening, everyone,
No guarantee you even get it.
and welcome to the work session of the Board of Commissioners.
Tonight?
I'd like to advise we met in executive session prior to this meeting on legal matters. If you'd please stand and join us in the Pledge of Allegiance led by our Police Department.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We have several presentations this evening before we get into discussions about next week. The first one is by Dr. John Werry on a COVID update and a COVID presentation. Dr. Werry is remote. He will be joining us via Zoom, but we will be seeing his presentation here in the room, as well as you will be in the audience at home.
Great, okay, hopefully we can get the slides up, but thanks for the opportunity to join this group and chat for just a couple minutes. As we get the slides up, I'll tell you a little bit about my background and sort of the reason why I decided to ask for just a couple minutes to chat with this group. I'm a faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania. I've been studying viral immunology for, you can go ahead one more slide. I've been studying viral immunology for almost 25 years. I'm the chair of the Department of Pharmacology. I direct the Institute for Immunology, and I sit on the Penn COVID Research Oversight Committee, helping to guide some of the immunology-related research, both in the lab and in the clinic, related to how we're responding to the COVID pandemic. I also am involved in some national advisory committees. You can find me at the various things on this slide if anybody wants more information. So one reason to chat is to just offer some perspective about what we're learning about COVID-19 and offer some of that information either now or in the future from the standpoint of the science or perhaps ways we can think about this information to make local decisions. Next slide. So just a couple brief points about COVID-19. So first, this is a viral infection of the lungs. We get a lot of respiratory pathology and pneumonia, but it's very different from other infections. About 15% of patients end up hospitalized. So with 4.5 million infections in the US, that's a lot of hospitalized patients. But even non-hospitalized patients can get extremely sick. People have described it as the worst 2 to 3 weeks of their life, way worse than normal flu, and mortality is 4%, which is way higher on average than other respiratory infections. Immune responses can play a role in both protecting and also causing some of the damage. And I can talk about that later if people are interested in the science. The virus can affect everyone, but it's way worse in people who are older, but also people with comorbidities. So even young people are getting quite sick, and especially people with background cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, chronic kidney disease, and other things. The other thing that's, I think, very pertinent right now is the severe infections are disproportionately affecting minorities and underprivileged or underserved communities. Treatments are emerging. There are some. Hydroxychloroquine is not one, but some of the others are emerging, but none are game changers yet. They're having a marginal effect. And the last point is that vaccines are very likely still at least 6 months away, probably more like 12 months to being deployed to hundreds of millions of people to really curb this pandemic completely. The timeline of infection is a really important part of what's happening here. And once people get infected, you can click ahead. People are often symptomatic for 3 to 5 days. They're infectious for 3 to 5 days before they're symptomatic. So they're spreading the virus before they even know they're infected. Then when they get infected, things can be very severe. And many patients actually have very long lingering effects afterwards. And so one of the biggest changes in clinical practice is the emergence of what we're calling a post-COVID clinic. People with long-term, perhaps permanent changes in respiratory biology or cardiovascular systems that are requiring long-term care well after the infection is gone. Next slide. So where do we stand? So obviously things are not good. 4.5 million infections in the US. The US is 4% of the world's population, but we're 25% of the infections, 22% of the mortality. And so obviously we have way more infections per capita than anybody else. But what's interesting about what's happened in the US is unlike almost any other country on the planet, we initially as a country controlled things only to see it massively reemerge. Part of that we could get into later for various decisions that were made around the country, but part of it is because there were different local epidemics occurring simultaneously that were occurring at different rates and with different progression. Next slide. So taking a closer look at PA, and I'm sure many of you have seen these kind of graphs, we see things are reemerging in Pennsylvania, and one reason for asking to talk to this group is one of the places that they're reemerging is actually Delaware County. So Delaware County, one or two of the western counties, and Philadelphia County are really the hot spots in Pennsylvania. Next slide. So if we take a look at Havertown, Delco, and then Havertown specifically, so there are about 8,900 infections so far in Delaware County. This is updated just today. You can see that in Havertown, Haverford Township, we've had a pretty steady number for some time, and then just about 3 weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, we saw a major inflection point in this curve. And in fact, I checked just before we got on the call, the numbers have spiked even more. The data for today was just posted, and we had an 8% increase just over the last 3 days. So we've really hit a major inflection point where the number of infections in Haverford Township are increasing at an almost exponential rate. The numbers are still relatively low. There are 50,000 people in the township and about 500 infections, but the rate of change is more concerning than the absolute numbers. Next slide. And so this is not just old people. So the actual number of people infected between different age groups is about the same in people from 20 to 29 years old as it is in people over 65. The death rate, which is something that I think is important to keep in mind, is much higher than yearly influenza, which kills 30 or 40,000 people a year. It might be 50-fold higher for young, healthy people. So people in their 20s to 50s are still dying at a very high rate from this infection. Mortality overall is still higher in the elderly, as it is for all diseases, but that doesn't mean that young people aren't getting very sick. Moreover, if you click ahead, young people are spreading this, and it's really the young people that we need to get the message out to stop certain activities, to limit spread, and allow us to reopen the economy. So we do know some environments that are causing spread, and it's very clear that bars and indoor large group social activities are really contributing to the spread. Bars, parties, large social gatherings, restaurants eating in certainly are contributing to spread in other places. And what we're hearing a lot about are nursing homes and assisted living facilities, but any indoor group activity is a risk. Transmission is probably 20-fold lower outdoor compared to indoor, and that has to do with ventilation and the way the airflow is in different environments. And not wearing a mask is clearly contributing to spread around the country. Next slide. So what does social distancing really mean here? Well, the basic principle is reducing the time, proximity, and contact with other people or things other people touch. So a lot of people have been asking how many people in a group is okay, and we have some guidelines on this. It changes a little bit. When I made these slides, if you click ahead, it was 25 people in a group. So why? What are the principles that allow us to think about social distancing? It really all depends on the amount of infection in the area and the amount of activity going on, people moving around. So in Havertown, the number of infections overall is relatively low, but it's definitely increasing. So should that change the way we think about certain social gatherings? Perhaps. Next, click ahead. So movement to and from other places. We all know how much activity is going on with people visiting the shore and other places. Probably not a lot of sort of other national travel, but certainly the local regional travel has increased in the summer. And then hygiene. Are we doing enough wearing masks and really encouraging the use of hand sanitizer, which clearly plays a role? So one of the key things that I want to mention just in the last maybe 2 or 3 minutes here is this concept of R0. So this is what scientists use as a measure for how quickly a virus spreads. And the basic principle here is for every person infected, how many new people do you infect? And so an R0 of 1 would mean that if I get infected, on average, I will only infect 1 new person. That leads to a flat line in the bottom left. If, however, I infect 2 new people for every time I'm infected, this now becomes exponential and explosive. So if the R0 is only 1.2, we can go from 100 infections to 5,000 infections in just 3 weeks. If you increase it just a little bit more to 1.5, that means on average, 1 person infects 1.5 people. Within 3 weeks, 100 people becomes 500,000. So things that change this R0, this rate of spread, are really important. So click ahead. So in Houston, there was a really interesting epidemiological example of this. Early in May, epidemiologists were modeling what that R naught value was, and it was fluctuating up and down just around 1. They predicted changes in behavior as things got hot in Houston and people moved indoors, combined with lack of reinforcement of wearing masks and sort of opening up the local economy. And sure enough, the predictions turned out to be exactly right, that hovering around 1 for the rate of transmission with a change in activity led to it going above 1 and an explosive spread in the Houston area that we now all know about. Next slide. So what's happening in Havertown? What does this mean? So we are fluctuating right around 1. We've seen an increase in infections lately. We see an increase in activity, increase in sort of social interactions, maybe some increased complacency. And I've heard a lot of my local friends sort of say things like, well, it's really only the elderly, or it's all nursing homes and assisted living. So what I think we need to look towards are some of the impending behavioral changes that will happen just because time is moving forward. The question of how school restarts, the associated activities with that, not just kids physically in school, but buses, parents shopping for school clothes, parents shopping for school supplies, changes in activities around the way you go back to school. Fall sports, how do we do fall sports and keep people interacting, and other changes that will happen. So we can click through this slide and I'll wrap up quickly. There aren't very many choices. We can't shut down the economy for good. We can't open everything up. The economic choices on either end of that spectrum are both impossible. There is a middle ground, and if we click ahead to the next slide, that middle ground really is sending a clear message about the importance of social distancing, wearing masks, and good hygiene. Last slide, one more. And so there are a few things on this slide that I just wanted to make these points. Fauci has said 5 things over and over again. They're listed here on the right. Wear masks, close the bars, social distancing. If you're going to have restaurants open, make sure they're well ventilated or eat outside, and personal hygiene. My reason for coming to you today is, one, to offer a resource that if there are questions and environments where I might be useful from a scientific side, I'm happy to do so. We live in Havertown. I'm really interested in making sure we're not the hotbed of spread. But I also think it's really important for our local leaders to be sending clear messages about what's important about local activities to, importantly, keep businesses open rather than have to go to a full shutdown again. So I'll stop there. I hope I didn't take too much time, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Any questions?
I have a question.
Mr. DeMille.
So I was sick in January. I was pretty sick for almost a month. I had slight fever the first couple of days. I was tested for the antibodies around May, I would say, and I tested positive for the antibody. Is it possible that I had it in January? And what's the? Is it also possible that it was a false antibody test?
So both things are possible. Our first case in Philadelphia, documented case, was March 8th or 9th. So the amount of virus in the area in January is probably very low. That doesn't mean it was impossible, depending on where you traveled. It's possible also to have a false positive on the antibody test. There are so many antibody tests and they vary in quality. More likely, you have antibodies, you had the disease at some point, whether in January or after that, and then you have the antibodies and they'll probably stick around for some time. We don't yet know whether that means that you'll be protected or not, which I assume would be one of the follow-up questions. We just don't know that yet.
Well, would I still be able to be tested for the antibody? Is that possible?
Will you still be able to be tested for the antibody?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can get retested for the antibody for sure. And there are different tests that can be run for sure.
Are they all blood tests?
Yeah.
They're all blood tests, are they not?
Yeah, all the antibody tests are blood tests. There are various places, including Penn, working on both saliva tests and perhaps nasal tests for antibodies. The nasal and saliva tests will also be for virus. You can get those tests as well.
Okay. Any other questions?
Dave, could I ask you to, if we could just cut this segment out of the YouTube video and that we could send this to our email list, just this presentation to our residents?
We can distribute the PowerPoint, yeah.
Yeah,
We can distribute the PowerPoint. We'll see what we can do about editing the video. I'm not sure we could do that in the immediate future, but we can work on that.
Okay.
Actually, Yeah, I had a question for the doctor. When he answered Steve, he said the first case in the region was March 8th. There's a lot of people who think, and I guess maybe it's mistakenly, that in January or February, when they had some illness that knocked them out, that they think they had it. And I'm not suggesting Steve's acting this way, but there are folks in the world who think, well, I had it and I'm fine, and they're not that worried about getting it again. Could you tell us, I mean, what is the likelihood that people had this virus before, Philadelphia saw its first case in what you said, the first or second week of March?
Yeah, I think the possibilities are low. They're not zero. We know that the first cases in the U.S. Very likely now at the farthest back were late December, probably more like early January. And they were all on the West Coast. So I think it's unlikely on the East Coast, but it's entirely possible before March 8th the virus was in Philadelphia and people got it. We have analyzed, and people in New York have done the same experiments, people who said, I was sick, I had symptoms in February, I definitely had it. Both our analysis in Philadelphia and the analysis in New York says that about 35% of those types of reports turn out to be positive. 65% are not positive. They had some other virus. Anybody that has kids know that respiratory viruses run rampant through the winter and the early spring. There are a lot of things that can make you feel like that. So most of the time, it was probably something else, but maybe a third of the time people really had it.
The answer to the question is it's very possible that people who were ill in January or February could have had it without us knowing. Because isn't it possible that it was here a lot earlier than, because I thought I had read that somewhere, that it may have been on the East Coast a lot earlier. That's why New York spiked so high so fast. And the short amount of...
It's thought that there were multiple seedings into New York, so it is entirely possible that it was here in January and February, and we didn't see our first hospitalized case until March. Yeah. We're learning that a little bit by doing these studies of antibody in people that have those kind of reports. We don't have, you have to trust self-reporting of when people were sick, so it becomes a little bit fuzzy there, but we're starting to get a handle on those kind of things based on screening for antibodies in people who report having been sick in January and February. But the bottom line is that all the data is not in, so I can't give you a hard answer to that question. The question of whether people are protected now, we simply don't know. There are cases of people reporting being reinfected, so we can't change behavior based on whether people have antibodies or think that they've been exposed in the past.
I have another question for you, since I might as well utilize your expertise. A lot of people think that this came from a lab in China. I mean, the question is, a lot of people ask, how did it get so bad? Is this a totally new virus, or is this an old virus that mutated quickly, or how did it get to this point where it's got almost everything to kill someone?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. So it very likely did emerge from a lab or an area around a lab in China. It was almost certainly not a malicious event. It was probably a natural virus being studied in the lab, or the activities around that food market in China led to a virus similar to that escaping into people. This happens all the time. We have viruses that come from animals, often bats, that emerge as infections in humans. So there's nothing sort of untoward or malicious about this having happened. It happened 2 other times with coronaviruses. Luckily, they did not spread as fast as this virus spreads. It's happened with Ebola multiple times. It happened with Zika, and it's happened with dengue. This is an event, and it happens with influenza, different kinds of influenza viruses. This is an event that happens on an unpredictably regular basis, that we see viruses emerge from other species and enter into humans and cause varying levels of disease. All of us have been worried about this exact kind of pandemic event every time we've seen the original SARS virus, an Ebola outbreak, the Zika virus outbreak. Luckily, some of those other viruses have not spread as efficiently as this virus did. This is just a perfect storm of a virus spreading very fast and an inability to really contain it once we know some of the features of the virus.
So if it came from a lab, it somehow escaped that lab.
Either a lab or the activities around that lab, isolating the virus from nature or the food market. Somehow that same virus that was in the lab, that's also, you can find this virus in nature, it's absolutely a natural virus, the virus ended up in people.
Okay. Commissioner Siegel has a question.
Yeah, thank you. The question that's in the news and that everyone's asking is, given everything you know or that you studied, you think it's wise to in schools at this point, even a couple days a week, or what's the prudent thing for our schools to be doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a critical question. It's a very difficult question. I have two kids who have to get back to school for so many reasons. I think it's going to result in infectious spreading because of school reopening. And like we're seeing in Indiana today, and Minnesota today, and other places almost daily, we're going to have to shut down schools again when that event happens. It's not if that event happens, it's when that event happens. I think having a robust homeschooling approach in place, getting us through, I hope, October, November, when we can curb the infections in the local area and then open back up slowly. I think we're not necessarily putting our students at a huge risk, but we are putting the staff and people with comorbidities at a risk to be around that environment. There are ways that you could go back part-time that I think would minimize those risks, so they're not going to go away.
Thank you.
One more question. I keep saying that, but I can keep finding questions. Why is Europe doing better with it? I think I saw something where France didn't have any new infections and some other European countries. Why are they doing? Are we just being so irresponsible?
You throw me the hard question at the end because there isn't a politically correct answer to this question, but the answer is yes. We're being irresponsible and ineffective in the way we've gone about this, and it's both nationally and to some extent locally. Although I'm not saying locally in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. I think in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia we've done better than average, but I think our national response to this has been terrible compared to the rest of the world. And we have quite literally side-by-side comparisons to the way other countries have reacted, with the initial events being very similar and then the outcome of that being very, very different.
Do you think there's anything else we could be doing in Havertown?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Do you think there's anything else we could be doing in Havertown at this point?
Well, I don't know, and this is something that maybe this group can think about. I think everybody's growing tired of this, and anybody that walks around Havertown on a Saturday afternoon or a Friday night, knows that there are social activities that are ramping up that weren't happening in April when people were taking this more seriously. Weather's changed; it's been a long time. People are going to the shore, so I think clear messaging about the potential risks of large gatherings, social gatherings, especially when there's alcohol involved. People are talking more loudly, social inhibitions are down. I think consistent messaging is really important from leadership. I'd like to see us keep the businesses and restaurants open in a limited fashion for all the obvious reasons, but I think if we're not careful and that increase in infections we've seen in the last week or so continues, I worry that there's gonna be no choice but to shut everything down completely.
Doctor, one last question for me. Early in this virus, we heard a lot about medical personnel becoming infected, and now we hear very little about that. Is that because there are little to no infections now with the treating physicians and nurses that are treating these folks? And is that a function of the efficacy of the personal protection equipment they're using? Or is there any thinking or theory that these folks' exposure to it is building up any kind of immunity?
Yeah, great question and very important question. So we've studied this at Penn. It is not because they're building up immunity. We've tested them for antibodies. We know how many of them have been exposed and what the course of that is. The exposure is exceedingly low. That's because of PPE. Hospital workers know how to wear masks, know how to socially distance, know how to limit infection spread in the hospital. And simple guidelines, hand sanitizer, masks, PPE, absolutely works to stop infections. That's the most clear message that we can get from all of that.
That's a good message.
Any others? Doctor, thank you very much. It was very informative, very
Yeah,
sobering
thank you,
as well.
everybody.
Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Doc. I'll give you a minute to clear your computer, I guess.
I think we're ready.
Dave or the shade tree, you go.
Oh, I'm sorry. My mistake.
Our next presentation is our Township Engineer, Mr. Dave Pinoni, our annual MS4 report.
Be just a brief report. The board probably remembers we do this every year. The state of Pennsylvania requires that we have a MS4 system, which is a municipal separate storm sewer system. We are in the third year of our permit. We're in our third permit. The first permit we got was in 2003. Every 5 years we have to get a new permit. So our latest permit became, as part of that whole permit process and part of the compliance, I have to give you somebody has to give you a report annually at a public meeting. So our current permit is effective until became effective on March of 2018, and it's a 5-year permit. It'll expire in March of 2023. As part of this latest permit, we're required to do what's called pollution reduction plan. It's a PRP. And the PRP requires you to remove 10% of the sediment in the Darby and Cobbs Creek watersheds by April 17th of 2024. Strictly speaking, in Dave and Amy's terms, that's an unfunded mandate. To remove that sediment, we have to do string bank. We're proposing string bank restoration. It's the most cost-effective way to do it. Frankly, it is millions of dollars worth of string bank restoration. We talked about that last year. That's something that we're starting to plan and starting to process. Whether or not the state holds everybody, especially with everything that's going on, to the timelines of April of 2024, we'll see. But right now, that is a timeline for that work. As a side issue, Dave and I talked about, if you remember, I think it was last meeting, we talked about removal of invasive species along some of the stream banks. The removal of invasive species and replacement of them by themselves will not qualify for PRP work. But as we do stream bank restoration work, that we will remove invasive species and replant with native species. So it'll be part of the PRP plan. The MS4 program requires to meet 6 minimum control measures. We've gone through this before: public outreach, public involvement, illicit discharge detection, construction site runoff control, post-construction runoff control, and pollution prevention and municipal housekeeping. We have 163 outfalls in the township. So there's 163 places where stormwater discharges to a waterway. We've required to test every one of those. We tested every one of them twice in our second round of permits. This current permit, we don't have to test, but we must visually inspect every one of those outfalls. And at this point, we're not required to test. We'll do a visual, see if there's any funny odor issues or discoloration. And if we do find something like that, which we have never found in the past, then we would proceed with some additional testing. Our entire system's been mapped. We continue to do what we call our BMP inspections, which is when a stormwater management system is built in a township, we get monies donated to the BMP fund, whether it's a small system like that turns into a single-family home or a large system like the Quarry Center, and we periodically inspect them. Quite frankly, they've been on hold for a while. Once stuff in March hit, we thought that might be a little inappropriate to go on private property, so we'll figure out when we sort of re-immobilize for that work. Last thing, normally I would announce upcoming events, like cleaning at Darby Creek, but all the events were postponed this year. So when and if they come up, I'm sure this board will be aware. Any questions?
So we haven't started yet anything in reducing this, and we have to
The sediment reduction?
Right.
No, we've conceptualized it. The state of Pennsylvania's approved the plan. The only township I'm aware of that started, to be honest with you, is Lower Merion, which is not unusual. Lower Merion does everything first. It's not inexpensive, so we've been working with Amy and Dave, trying to plan ahead, and once then we'll implement. But no, we physically have not designed anything, permitted anything, or started any of the work yet.
Okay. Is it a one-time project, or is it
It doesn't have to, it'll be implemented over a series of years. So it's not, we won't be doing, it's thousands of feet of stream bank. So we won't be doing thousands of feet of stream bank at one time. And we're always trying to capture something if we can. If there's a rain garden that's built, if we can use that to capture. Now, the rain gardens are minimal in terms of sediment removal. But if there's any project that happens that we can use to capture and take credit for the sediment removal, we try to capture that.
Is this traditionally has this traditionally been an unfunded mandate, or is this?
First time we've had it.
First
time in the state of Pennsylvania. Yeah, it's the first time. This is the first time through it. It started, frankly, in the Chesapeake Bay.
Yeah.
So the other part
That was unfunded?
The western part of the state saw it first, because Chesapeake's always been the more sensitive ecologically. Now we're seeing it in Delaware Bay Basin. But this is the first time we're required to proactively remove sediment.
Why is it an unfunded mandate?
Well, it's going to cost the township of Haverford millions of dollars, and the money's not coming from anywhere.
The state's just going to force this on us,
Correct.
and every
The
other.
state regulation, technically, I believe it's a federal regulation. Like the DP usually doesn't do their own regulations. The DP enforces federal regs. So the feds will say, remove sediment. The state's job is to enforce it. And we've been doing the MS4 plans for 15 years now. And this next round requires a sediment removal. It's a little bit of a harsh way for me to describe it as an unfunded mandate, but I don't know what to
That's
call
what
it.
it is.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Our next presentation is by Mark Pennington, the shade tree ordinance that's being proposed.
Good evening, everyone. I appreciate you allowing me to join you tonight. This is a follow-up from presentation to the full board last November. And the basic gist is to try to change the code related to trees in the township. We've been working with Commissioner Hart since November to come up with the current draft. There are a couple main things we were looking to change. Dave, you can go to the next slide. Yeah, the first one was to eliminate a very confusing loophole in the current code. It's something called the tree protection zone. Basically, our current code, and to back up for a second, our current code, if you were going to develop a piece of property, current code says if you take down trees, you've got to replace them on a mathematical formula. If you take down inches of trees, you've got to replace them with a formula of inches. That's a high-level view of it. But one of the parts of that calculation was the developer was not responsible to replace any trees that were in the building envelope or 16 feet around that new building envelope. So obviously that can be a pretty large area. It could have been full of trees that the developer didn't have to worry about replacing those trees. And that is one, it's difficult to even understand when you're trying to apply the code the way it's written. And two, it's unlike anything in any of the neighboring townships. So that's number one thing we were looking to do, is eliminate that tree protection zone and have the whole property subject to the calculation. The next was, current code says if you have a 24-inch tree on that property, you've got to replace that tree inch by inch. So if you have a 24-inch tree, you've got to plant 24 more inches of trees. If you're replacing smaller trees, it's a 1-inch to 4-inch calculation. So through these iterations and working with Jerry, we've agreed to, it's fine to change that calculation to a 30-inch tree. So that makes it more lenient than the current code. And the other thing that has come up in the past is developers, prior to applying for a building permit, they would all but clear cut the property, so there aren't any trees there for them to have to replace. So we're proposing that a couple different things related to this. It could be a developer or a homeowner or a business. If you were going to take down a heritage tree, any tree 30 inches or larger, the code applies and you have to replace trees. If, with a caveat, if a tree is diseased, damaged, or risk, then you don't have to replace it. If you're taking a 30-inch or larger tree down for convenience, it has to be replaced according to the calculation. If you're going to remove 6 or more trees in a year that are 6 inches or larger on your property, same thing. You've got to comply to this code. And that is a change to the current code. And other major change we are looking for is a very specific process if someone doesn't meet the code. If that developer's property, he can't do the calculations and replace those trees per code, we would like to have a very specific requirement in the code that says that person has to contribute to the township for what we would call a shade tree fund. The wording is really irrelevant, but basically they would have to make a payment and the board would decide what that payment would be per tree. And that would go into the general fund for use to put trees in the township. And a developer may not be able to put trees in due to severe slopes, underground utilities, a variety of things. But the committee needs a very specific way to address that issue, and it happens regularly. So we're asking that the township consider changing that code to give us a very specific path that a developer can't meet the calculations. And that, in a nutshell, is it.
Hey, Mark, Mr. President.
Go ahead, questions?
So Mark, how does this ordinance compare to Radnor or Lower Merion or other townships?
It's much more in line. Radnor and Lower Merion do not have that tree protection zone. They also have heritage tree protection. Their calculations are still more strict than ours. We started out more strict, and working with Jerry, we've tuned it to where it is now, which we think is still reasonable, but in general terms, it's not as strict as Radnor and Lower Merion. Radnor and Lower Merion both have a much more robust tree committee, and they actually have arborists on staff. They have a much more aggressive approach to this than Haverford Township does at the moment.
And what are their fees if you were not able to, you had a 30-inch heritage tree and you weren't able, I assume you could replace that with 15 2-inch trees, right? Or you pay a fee in lieu of planting trees, and what would that fee, you have not established that fee yet?
No, we're leaving that really up to the board.
What's Lower Merion and Radnor do?
What does it cost at any given point in time to buy and have planted a 2-inch tree? It should be something in that ballpark, which was the logical answer to it.
So what's a 2-inch tree cost?
It'd be $100 to $200. Planted by an outside.
It could be a $6,000 expense if you wanted to take down a 30-inch heritage tree and not be able to replace it.
And that's going to be up to the board as to how you want to price that. But I think that would be the start. And again, it would be, if you're a homeowner and you want to take down that 30-inch tree, just because you don't like the tree, then there will be costs associated with it. If you're taking it down because it's diseased and dangerous, they don't have to meet the requirement.
Mr. President?
Yes.
I had looked at the ordinance and worked with the committee through the ordinance committee, and I have concerns in the regulations and requirements where their permits are required. I can understand for planting and removing a tree, but we are, and apparently we've done this historically, theoretically, you are required to have a permit to prune a tree, which means even under the ordinance, almost any action, or spray a tree. And even if you want to use a pesticide because you're trying to remove, the spotted lanternflies, you can't do it without a permit. And I suspect those are provisions that are ignored far more than they're ever honored. So I would suggest that they be removed from the ordinance, unless there's a reason. We're gonna tell every resident, if you have a public shade tree, you have to come to us to remove, a branch or two. I just don't think that's practical, and I don't think that's what we're trying to do.
That part of it applies to public shade trees, so those are street trees. It's not a tree in your backyard.
Right.
It's a street tree. And that's
But
been
still,
in there,
the public
and
typically takes care of those trees themselves and doesn't call the township every time something's needed. And I just find it hard to believe that we're really gonna enforce that someone sprayed a tree and didn't get a permit. And I don't think we've done it now.
So I'm confused. You're saying it's just public?
that part, that's not a change. This has been in the ordinance. It applies to street tree. They're not private trees, they're trees that are within the right of way.
So with this new ordinance,
I understand that, but
private
it's,
trees?
I don't care if
No,
it's
it
been there
doesn't
for
put
100
private
years.
trees in.
If we're not enforcing it and it's not practical, I would want it removed from an ordinance.
Well, I think, I today listened to somebody from State College who was the head of their shade tree commission, who described someone who, by pruning, they just chopped off the top of all the trees in front of the home. Now, they require a permit, so they were able to fine the person, but if we don't require, somebody could do that, and we don't have an ordinance to stop them from doing it.
How many times have we issued permits for pruning or spraying a public shade tree in the last year? That's the question I'd want to know to a resident. I don't suspect anyone has the answer right now.
Okay, but if we take it out, if someone does that, we don't have a protection. There's no reason they didn't need a permit.
And we're just talking about trees that are in the public right of way, right, Jerry?
Right.
So these are trees that people wouldn't get permits for. They'd call the township and say, the tree limb fell off the tree, come get it. And the township would maintain this tree, so the amount of permits that we would give out would be zero. We do the work. The township is required to maintain the trees, and we do.
Not every resident knows what are public shade trees. We just had an issue in my ward where there's a question of what is the distance that is covered from the center of the road, and led to some questions that I know Mr. Berman's aware of, at least, and the tree crew.
And it's not necessarily from the center of the road, it's from where the right-of-ways are. And that can vary on every street where the utilities are. One of the questions I have is, this affects development. Has this been inspected or commented on by our planning commission? This proposed, what I'd like to see, since this has such an impact on building by eliminating certain things, I'd like to get an opinion from our planning commission, because all these things are going to be caught and enforced. We're going to be part of the planning commission. People aren't going to be coming to the board of commissioners for approval on a tree issue. So the bulk of this, I think the biggest issue is on development and fees in lieu of planting trees, primarily when there's construction, new construction, and when a planning commission involvement there, and that's forwarded to us. So what I would like to say is, I'd like to see this go to the planning commission for review before we come back and even vote on this. Is that, Mr. Berman, I'll ask you, does that sound reasonable, or Mr. Pannoni, either one? I'm not sure who the expert is on this, but it seems like it's a big impact on development, so I would like to get comment from our planning commission on this.
Bill, I totally agree with you. I believe that's where it should head.
Well, actually, is it, first and
And if I
foremost, is
could
it possible to
make
get a
just
black line of this?
Two quick
Red line
follow-up
version?
comments. One,
Good. Oh,
regarding Commissioner Siegel's point. To be clear, that section of this code, the public shade tree, is not something we were dwelling on. That, as Commissioner Hart mentioned, that's been in the code for who knows how long. In my 3 years on the shade tree committee, I've never had a question about that. And I'm sure Commissioner Siegel's correct. It's probably a free-for-all. It does seem to me that since these trees are in the public right-of-way, there needs to be some statement about how they should be treated and maintained. The second point is regarding going to the planning commission. I think that makes sense. That just to be clear, though, what happens now is a developer comes into with a set of plans, the shade tree committee looks at it, tries to apply the current code, which has a calculation, and the developer doesn't meet that code. Right now, the shade tree committee is in a situation that they can say, it doesn't meet the code. By rights, we should be saying, this development plan does not meet the code, and you would have to apply for a variance from the code in order to proceed. Again, my 3 years on the committee, I have never seen that happen. What happens is there is some compromise. So you have between a township representative, in this case, Celia, and the committee, there is some agreement made that that developer may plant more trees in a local park or make a contribution to the township to plant some trees someplace. And that contribution, again, in 3 years, I have no idea where any contribution has ended up and if and when it's been made. So we strongly believe there needs to be a very specific process that not only the tree committee, but representatives from the township can follow when someone can't meet the current code. And there's always, no matter how we write the code, there's always going to be instances where the developer can't meet the code. If the option is to just say you have to go get a variance, then that's what would have to be implemented, unless there's a logical process that can be managed.
Yeah, and I think I'd like to see a logical ordinance on this so that the planning commission can do their job, so that it's not every case becomes an exception, as opposed to more and more normal cases that they can adjudicate and recommend the final development plan at that level, rather than having to get us township staff in to negotiate between planning commission and contractors every time. That doesn't seem to be productive. It's not intuitive anyway, so.
We can ask Kelly Kirk to put that on the agenda for the planning commission,
Okay.
if that's your desire.
That would be my suggestion, but I'm only one.
For
I
that.
totally agree. Agreed.
And then,
I'd agree.
All right, if you do that, then we'll strike it from our meeting next week and wait for the planning commission to.
Before this goes to the planning commission, could somebody produce a red line version of this document so I can see what our law is compared to what they're trying to change?
I can
So
send
you'd
it
like
you.
to see the existing ordinance redlined with what the proposed changes are?
Correct.
Would. And if I could get clarification on something, if I understand, this ordinance applies to everybody with regard to any public shade tree, a tree that is on the right-of-way, in front of the property, or somewhere that it shades or is on a township road or township property. But as far as a developer goes, any tree on a vacant lot is subject to these rules about replacing trees or paying fines or whatever we want to call it, a contribution.
and even residents, not just developers.
No, the only thing that applies to residents would be the heritage tree.
Here, she, well, yeah.
The, the specific reason for changing the ordinance is because of the problem with developers, of where the Shade Tree Commission the trees are getting taken down, and we're not really replacing them. We're trying to maintain the tree cover in the township. So that's the reason that the ordinance is being rewritten. It's really, more than anything, aimed at the planning, at subdivisions.
Okay.
Develop.
But
I'd
isn't
like
this
to make
everybody?
one more comment also. The gentleman before me was talking about spending millions of dollars. It's all related one way or another to water and runoff. Trees are a big part of avoiding that problem.
Right.
So this would be, I think, in the township's best interest to have a robust plan to keep the tree canopy in the township from everything from water runoff to property values. And again, this is not as strict as our neighboring townships.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Bennington, for that.
Thank you, I appreciate
Thank
it.
you. Mr. Boone.
Planning commission, you said to the planning commission, and it may have been vetted or not, we definitely want to make sure it's not contradictory to anything that's in the code already, and maybe Kelly and Joe, and if my office could help if need be. But if it progresses, because it's a standalone ordinance, the chapter 170, it's not zoning, it's not land development, so I believe it's part of land development by reference.
Correct.
So we probably should do a conflict check and a reference check on the two ordinances.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of work that has to be done before we would pass something like this. I totally agree. It intersects with planning, zoning, and development everywhere here.
That does become a problem, and it's not just in Haverford, it's in a lot
Right.
of towns where it's in both the land development code and then in a standalone ordinance, and they conflict, so that's a good suggestion.
Right. Our next update is from our police department, our monthly crime update. Chief John Viola, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. The report for the police department report for the month of July, 11 criminal arrests, no juvenile arrests, 97 traffic citations issued, 7 non-traffic citations issued with 27 written warnings, 114 parking tickets. No robberies, no burglaries, no attempts, no aggravated assault. A sex offense that's under investigation with a known family member. 1 motor vehicle theft, 200 block of Warrior Road, and an arrest warrant has been obtained for the defendant who's a family member. And we only had 2 thefts from vehicles, one is 1600 block of Lawrence Road, and one in a unit block of Treaty Road, and we had 2 K-9 usages in the month of July. That's it.
Thank you, Chief. Are there any commissioner committee updates?
Just a couple of things from finance that are coming up next week, some changes to our act, I'm sorry,
457.
the 457B deferred compensation plan, as well as we're going to adopt our budget we're going to adopt our budget adoption schedule next week. The schedule is no different than what we have followed in the last several years. As far as the amendments to the 457B deferred compensation plan, I invite Amy, if she's still here. Yeah, Amy, just give us a 30 seconds.
Thank you, Amy.
Sure. The 457B plan is a section of the IRS code similar to 401ks in the corporate world and 403Bs in the nonprofit world. It allows employees to defer or put into a supplemental retirement savings their own voluntary contributions into accounts. What historically has been the case here at Haverford is the police department participated in one plan and the civilian employees participated in another plan. The police department favored our plan. Our plan is a little less on fees, so they asked if they could also participate in the civilian plan, which is fine. We just have to have a planned amendment. So that is going to accomplish that. And the second question that's going to be before you to approve via motion is the allowance of Roth 457 plans. If you've heard of Roth IRAs, They're done on a post-tax basis. That would be similar here, where employees could defer income on a post-tax basis and put it into retirement savings. These are all voluntary, employee-funded accounts. The employees' administrative costs are spread over the participants in those accounts. So this motion will just allow those amendments to the plan.
Thank you for that explanation. Very good.
Mr. President?
Yes, Mr. Lewis.
Yes, I know that Commissioner McCluskey is not here, but is anybody on the library committee that could give us kind of an update on where the library stands in terms of moving forward in some kind of time frame? I don't know. We haven't heard much in the last, 4 or 5 months. So I'm just curious as to what the plan is and whether we want to have them come in next month to get things restarted. Seems like it's just stalled completely.
Mr. McCluskey's on Zoom.
Oh, is he on Zoom?
I believe so.
We do have Mr. McCluskey on Zoom.
Oh, I'm
I don't know
sorry.
if there's a report.
I'm sorry, Kevin. No, you're on there. You there?
Yeah, I don't have a report at this time. I mean, I think, I agree. I had a little trouble hearing you, but I agree that we need to start moving on that and make a decision and try to get some progress. Are we talking about the renovate the building? Is that what was being asked about?
The question is just this overall status and plan for
What's the
the
plan?
library. Yeah.
Yeah, as far as my latest understanding is the ball was in our court before coronavirus struck, and it remains there. So I think when this board wants to take it up next, I know Jerry and Connor had met with a group about the Brookline School, but the ultimate decision in terms of the direction of the library at this point sits with our board. So it's when we want to make that decision.
When does the library committee want to make a recommendation or make a report on your findings and your recommendation, or at some point next month or the following month? I don't know.
I think next month. I think maybe if we get an update from the building committee, and then if Commissioner Hart, if you would update the building committee on your meeting with there, I haven't heard what the result of that meeting was. If you want to give us a brief synopsis of that meeting right now, that'd be fine.
We've had a couple of meetings. Actually, yeah, I mean, I felt our agenda was to look at potential uses for the building should the library not move there. So we're kind of, if we decide to build a library there, then we're assuming the building's going to get knocked down, and this is just if the library does not move there. So that's what our meetings have been, just about alternative uses for the building should the library not move.
Okay. All right, so we need, I think maybe, Dan, you're the building committee, maybe next week we'll give an update on the building committee, add in an agenda item for next week. Did you get an update from the building committee on recommendations, and then we go for the following month and make a decision then, instead of sitting on this?
Well, I thought we were in March, looked at we can just review where we were in March, but.
Yep, I know, we'll get a review, but then I think it's time to make a decision. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Let's get moving and put this past us and move on.
I would just say, I think we need to make a decision, and I don't know if it's stuck in a committee, but I think it's time for us as a board to make the decision. I think before coronavirus hit, we had all the information, and we were going to vote at the next meeting.
Right. So
and understandably, we put that off at the time. But maybe we can just get an update as to whether anything has changed based on that. But otherwise, we should make a decision.
I will put it on the September meeting for a decision on the library's location, so that gives them a go, no-go on what they're going to effectively do, either renovate or move. So we'll put that on the agenda for September.
Thank you, Mr. President.
We can talk about it at the work session, I guess, if we have. Very good. All right.
Just one other, just on the committees in general, there's a number that haven't met, and I wonder if we could just reach out to, like the Senior Citizen Committee hasn't met at all, maybe reach out to the heads of the committees and tell them that we can set up a Zoom meeting for them so that they all know that they can meet.
Yes.
Okay.
Bill, one other, if you don't mind.
Yeah, good.
With tomorrow's bad weather being forecast. Manoa Fire Company has purchased water rescue equipment within the last, I believe it's 6 months, Joe? Is that right?
A little bit longer, yeah.
I'm sorry?
A little bit longer,
A
yeah.
little bit longer, but prepared. They've noticed an increase in water rescues in one of the storms, or several of the storms that we had. So they've been very proactive. I'm sure it's going to be a long day for our emergency services. So, I hope police and the paramedics and the fire volunteers, fire companies do well tomorrow. It's supposed to be bad.
Okay. No other committee updates. As you can see on the agenda for next week, we have a couple of ordinances, 2 traffic. The shade tree obviously won't be there. It's going to go to the planning commission, so ordinance P10 2020 will not be on the agenda next week. We've talked about the deferred income, the budget adoption schedule will be there. Contract awards, any questions on any of those? Professional services, salt contract, Harvard Road improvements.
Or I'd just like to thank Dave for the Harvard Road thing. That thing has been going on for years, and back in March, everybody that lives over there sent me an email about it, and thanks for all your help with all that, 'cause I know everybody is thrilled to get this over with.
Great. Any questions on any of those for the agenda for next week?
Mr. President, maybe Brian could just give us a summary of what basketball and tennis court improvements are planned.
What parks are getting
in this
updated?
Um, we are going to be opening a bid tomorrow for, we picked 4 locations of basketball courts, 2 at Bailey, 1 at Merwood, 1 at Coopertown, and 1 at Westgate. And what we're going to be doing is resurfacing the courts, then coating them in colors. So they'd be like, sort of like some of our tennis courts that you've seen that we did at Coopertown and Westgate and Paddock. And then we also bid a tennis court with that project, which was pulled out of the last work that we did on tennis courts because the neighbors and the commissioner wanted to weigh in. They've made a decision, and we put that in this contract for Preston. So they're going to be placing a tennis court at Preston and the fencing around that tennis court. And that'll all be open tomorrow.
So on the basketball courts, you put new poles and?
Yes, we're going to be putting
that's part of
new
it?
backboards, poles, so it's pretty much a complete restoration of the courts. And the Merwood court, we're trying to expand the footprint just a little bit because it's a very short court. So we're trying to expand the footprint about 5 or 6 feet to the side and about 10 feet longer. So.
Are the poles the newer type where you don't crack your skull going in for layup?
Yeah, we're actually going to make it, yeah, we're going to do 2 things. We're going to pull the poles off the macadam surface because that creates issues if you have to replace something. We're also going to make a 6-foot extension, which will allow us to make the courts on the existing footprint a little bit longer, similar to what we did at Elwell last time.
Right, yeah.
So I think that'll improve the courts, and I think the basketball players will be happy.
Very good. Okay, any questions on anything for next week? There being none, we're adjourned. Thank you.